Welcome to Episode 1, Failed Artist. Across 4 chapters, you'll hear real stories, build your vocabulary, and test your listening. Let's get started. Chapter 1, The Shadow of the Father, 1889. Welcome to your first professional skills improvement module. Your career as a researcher depends on your precision and your ability to process complex historical narratives in English. To master this language, you must be more than a passive reader. You must be an active investigator of the text. This report is a test of your intellectual stamina and will challenge your comprehension through a high-stakes look at a pivotal historical figure. You must listen carefully to every detail and read the narratives with extreme focus to succeed. If you wish to improve your skills, you must answer the questions correctly at the end of each section. Your progress depends on your ability to find specific facts within the text. Are you ready to begin your learning? Pay close attention, for every word matters in this mission. The story begins in the year 1889 in the small town of Braunau am Inn, but the boy's heart would soon belong to a place called Linz. This was the year that Adolf Hitler was born into a world that was changing very quickly. He was born in a time of great European power, but his own personal world was very small and very dark. His early life was spent in the shadow of his father, a man named Alois Hitler. For the young boy, home was not a place of peace, but a place of constant struggle and fear. Do you remember your own childhood home? And was it a place where you felt safe? For this boy, the home was a place of conflict because his father was an abusive figure. An abusive person uses their power to hurt others, and Alois was very strict and very harsh with his son. He was a man of the old world, a civil servant who worked for the government, and he expected his son to obey every rule without question. Alois wanted his son to follow in his footsteps and become a stable civil servant. However, the son was an aspiring artist who had no interest in working in a boring government office. An aspiring person has a strong desire to achieve a goal, and the boy was aspiring to reach the world of high culture and fine art. He spent his hours drawing and dreaming, which made his father very angry. The abusive father used his voice and his hands to try to break the boy's will, but the boy was very stubborn. Can you imagine the tension in a house where an aspiring artist is trapped by an abusive father? This conflict was the beginning of what the boy would later call the school of his life. He refused to study the subjects required for a government job and instead focused only on his own interests. His behavior was a direct challenge to the authority of the abusive man who ruled the house. The boy had a giant ambition that drove him forward every day. Ambition is a very strong desire to achieve something great through hard work and determination. His ambition was to become a famous painter, a creator of majestic images that would live forever. He did not want a quiet life in Linz. He wanted a life of fame and power in the world of art. This ambition became his shield against the pain caused by his abusive father. He believed that he was special and that he was meant for a destiny far greater than that of a simple clerk. What would you do if someone told you that your dreams were impossible or worthless? The boy did not listen to his father. He only listened to his own growing ambition. This ambition was not kind. It was hard and cold, like the stones of the city buildings he loved to draw. When his father died in 1903, the boy felt a sense of freedom, but the shadow of the father remained in his mind. He carried the lessons of that abusive relationship with him as he grew older. He learned that power was something used to control others, and he used his ambition to plan his escape from Linz. He was an aspiring young man who felt that Linz was too small for his giant dreams. He believed that his granite foundation was being built in these early years of struggle. A granite foundation is a base that is so hard it can never be broken. His foundation was built on resentment, pride, and the need to prove that his ambition was real. He waited for the right moment to leave his beloved Linz and show the world his talent. He wanted to prove that an aspiring artist could become a master of the world. The pain of the abusive years in Linz turned into a fuel for his future acts. He was ready to leave the small world of his childhood and enter the majestic world of the great capital city. Now, let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Abusive, using cruel, violent, or insulting treatment towards someone, often to control them. For example, the child had a very difficult life because his father was an abusive man who was often very angry. Aspiring, having a strong desire to become a particular type of person or reach a specific professional goal. For example, the aspiring writer spent every night working on her book because she wanted to be famous. Ambition, a strong desire to do or to achieve something, typically requiring great determination and hard work. For example, his ambition was so strong that he studied for 10 hours every day to pass the difficult exam. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 1 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. According to the source context, in what year was Adolf Hitler born? The text and source context explicitly state he was born in 1889. How does the narrative describe the behavior of Hitler's father, Alois? The source context 241-293 and the narrative identify him as an abusive figure. What was the primary career path that the father wanted his son to take? The father, a civil servant himself, wanted his son to follow this stable, non-creative path. What did the young Hitler call the granite foundation of his personality? The narrative explains that his belief in himself and his hard ambition formed this granite foundation. Which word best describes Hitler's attitude toward his artistic goals in Chapter 1? He is repeatedly described as an aspiring artist who focused only on his dreams. Chapter 2, The Enchantment of Vienna, 1906. Transitioning from the small, familiar city of Linz to the majestic capital of a giant empire is a massive leap for any student of history. To master this next chapter, you must pay close attention to the architectural details and the names of the great works of art mentioned. The city of Vienna was not just a place, it was a school that taught the young man about power, beauty, and the tonal tides of culture. If you want to master the English language, you must learn to describe your surroundings with the same passion and precision as the historical figures we study. Your success in the next quiz depends on your attention to these majestic details. Are you ready to prove your skills? In May 1906, the young man took his very first trip to the great city of Vienna. He was only 17 years old, and the city was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At that time, Vienna was one of the most important and beautiful cities in the entire world. Can you imagine the feeling of seeing a giant, majestic city for the very first time? He felt a deep sense of enchantment as he walked through the streets. Enchantment is a feeling of being under a spell or feeling great pleasure and attraction to something. This enchantment was caused by the beautiful buildings and the history of the city. He felt that the city was calling to him, and he was under its magical enchantment for several weeks. One specific part of the city made him feel especially amazed, and this was the Ringstrasse. In English, we call this the Ring Boulevard. The Ring Boulevard was a giant road that went around the center of the city, and it was lined with many majestic buildings. Majestic means having impressive beauty or great dignity. He spent many hours walking along the Ring Boulevard, and he marveled at the design of the buildings. To marvel means to feel great surprise or admiration for something beautiful. He marveled at the Parliament building, which looked like a temple from ancient Greece. He marveled at the Burgtheater and the town hall. But most of all, he marveled at the court opera, which he thought was the most beautiful building in the world. The young man was also very interested in music, and he was persuaded that the operas of Richard Wagner were the greatest ever written. To be persuaded means to be certain or convinced of something through thought or feeling. He was persuaded that Wagner's music was the voice of the German spirit. During his trip in 1906, he went to the court opera to see two specific operas. One was called Tristan and Isolde, and the other was called The Flying Dutchman. He was so moved by the music that he wrote postcards to his friend, August Kubizek, in Linz. He told his friend that the music was like a tonal tide, or mighty sound waves that flooded the hall. He was persuaded that he was witnessing something holy and powerful. The enchantment of the city and the music made him want to stay in Vienna forever. He was persuaded that he belonged in this majestic world of art and architecture. He did not see the poor people or the hungry children in the suburbs yet. He only saw the majestic exterior of the opera and the clean streets of the Ring Boulevard. However, even during this time of enchantment, he started to feel a little homesick. Homesick means feeling sad because you are away from your home and your family. He missed his mother, Clara, and he missed the small streets of his beloved Linz. He decided to go back to Linz after a few weeks, but the enchantment of Vienna stayed in his heart. He marveled at his own drawings when he got home, but they felt small compared to the giant buildings of the capital. He spent his time in Linz, dreaming about the day he would return to the city that had caused him such enchantment. He was persuaded that his talent as an artist would allow him to enter the Academy of Fine Arts. What would you do if you found a place that felt like your true home? Would you leave everything behind to live there? The young man was very determined to return to the place where he had marveled at the tonal tides of Wagner. He thought that the Ring Boulevard was the only world that mattered. He did not know that his next trip to Vienna would be much more difficult. The enchantment of 1906 was like a beautiful dream before a very dark reality. He was persuaded that his future was bright, but the city of Vienna was about to become his hardest school. Now let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Enchantment. A feeling of great pleasure or attraction, the state of being under a spell. For example, the enchantment of the city was so strong that the traveler never wanted to leave. Marveled. To be filled with wonder or astonishment at something impressive. For example, the students marveled at the ancient statues in the museum for many hours. Persuaded. To be convinced to do or believe something through reasoning or feeling. For example, I was persuaded by her argument that we should protect the environment more carefully. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 2 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. In what month and year did the young man make his first trip to Vienna? The source context Maser 9 and the narrative identify May 1906 as the date of his first visit. What was the name of the majestic ring road that fascinated Hitler? The narrative describes his fascination with the monumental buildings along the Ringstrasse. Which two operas by Richard Wagner did Hitler see during his first trip? These specific operas are mentioned in his postcards to August Kubizek Masser, 910. To whom did Hitler send postcards describing the mighty sound waves of the music? He sent these enthusiastic updates to his closest friend in Linz. What was Hitler's primary interest when he marveled at the parliament and the opera? The source context and the text emphasize his deep interest in the architectural style of the buildings, 1958. Quick break. If you're enjoying this episode, hit like and subscribe to help us make more videos like this. Now, on to Chapter 3. Chapter 3, Tragedy and Transition, 1907. Life is often defined by sudden changes and deep, painful tragedies. In this chapter, you will learn about the emotional events that changed the course of a young man's life forever. The emotional stakes are very high, and you must be ready to identify the cause and effect of these tragedies. Why did he leave his home? What made him stop pursuing his dreams for a time? Careful reading is the only way to master these historical details. You must prove your intellectual stamina by remembering the most difficult year of his early life. Let us look at the year 1907. The year 1907 was a year of great sadness and deep transition for the young man. He was now 18 years old, and he decided it was time to follow his ambition once and for all. He wanted to return to the majestic Vienna to become a student of art at the academy. He persuaded his widowed mother, Clara Hitler, to support him. Clara was a widow, which means her husband, the abusive Alois, had died several years before. She loved her son very much, and she persuaded herself that he had a giant talent. She gave him money from her small savings to go to the capital. He arrived in Vienna in September 1907, feeling very confident and proud. He was sure that his drawings would be accepted immediately. But while he was dreaming of art, a tragedy was starting at home in Linz. His mother, the only person he truly loved, was very sick with a terrible illness. In November 1907, he received the bad news that her health was getting much worse. He had to leave the city of his enchantment and go back to Linz to take care of her. Because of this tragedy, he deferred his dreams. To defer means to put something off until a later time or to postpone an action. He deferred his artistic goals because he wanted to be a loyal son during her final days. He stayed by her side and watched her suffer for many weeks. Can you imagine how hard it is to see the person you love most in the world slowly dying? On December 21st, 1907, Clara Hitler died, and the young man felt that his world had ended. He felt completely alone, as he was now an orphan. An orphan is a child whose parents are both dead. He had to stay in Linz for several months to settle her affairs. This means he had to take care of her money, her house, and her legal papers. He deferred his return to Vienna until February 1908. When he finally left Linz, his friend August Kubizek called it a jump into the dark. It was a jump into a new and dangerous life. This transition was very important because he was no longer a young boy with a family. He was a man with a hard heart and very little money. When he arrived in Vienna for the third time, he did not live in a majestic palace. He moved into a small, dark room at 31 Stumpergasse. The room was owned by a woman named Maria Zachries, who was a Czech immigrant. The room was not beautiful. The walls were damp and crumbling, and the furniture was infested with bugs. This was the beginning of his life in the other Vienna. The other Vienna was the world of the poor, the hungry, and the angry people who lived in the suburbs. In this other Vienna, the young man began to read many books and newspapers. Some of these newspapers were notorious for their messages of hate. Notorious means being famous or well known for something bad. These notorious newspapers, like the Deutsches Volksblatt, told him that the problems of the world were caused by people who were different from him. He read these notorious stories every day, and his heart became harder. He began to think that the Jewish press was poisoning the city with bad ideas. He was a student in a school of hate on the streets of the city. The notorious pamphlets told him that he was a member of a heroic race that was being cheated by others. What would you do if you were an orphan living in a room with bugs and damp walls? Would you try to be kind to others, or would you look for someone to blame for your pain? The young man chose to find someone to blame. He filled the hole in his heart left by his mother's death with the anger he found in the notorious press. He deferred his kindness and focused on his resentment. He was learning that the majestic buildings of the Ring Boulevard were built on a world of suffering. This transition from a sad orphan to an angry student of hate was the most important part of his time in Vienna. He was no longer the aspiring artist of 1906. He was becoming something much more dangerous. The granite foundation of his hate was being laid in the dark room on Stumpergasse. Now let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Deferred. Put off an action or event to a later time, postponed. For example, because he did not have enough money, the student deferred his university studies for 1 year. Notorious. Famous or well-known, typically for some bad quality, deed, or reputation. For example, the city was notorious for its high crime rate and its dangerous, dark streets at night. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 3 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. Why did Hitler defer his artistic ambitions in late 1907? The narrative explains he deferred his goals to care for Clara during her final illness. On what date did Clara Hitler die? The source context 67, 68, and text confirms she died on this specific date. What was the name of the landlady at the room on Stumpergasse? The source context identifies her as the Czech landlady of the apartment 3056. How does the narrative describe the room at 31 Stumpergasse? The text describes the room as having damp walls and an unpleasant odor, typical of the other Vienna. According to the narrative, what kind of newspapers did Hitler begin to read in the other Vienna? He focused on notorious publications like the Deutsches Volksblatt that preached anti-Semitism. Chapter 4, The Great Rejection, 1907 to 1908. This is the final section of your Skills Improvement Report. This chapter contains the most important turning point in the entire history of the failed artist. You will learn about the exact moment when a dream died and a dark future began for the world. Challenge yourself to remember the specific technical reasons for his failure at the academy. If you can understand the details of this rejection and the descent into the hostels, you will prove your mastery of English and your intellectual stamina. Are you ready to finish the mission? Pay close attention to the final details of his time in the School of Vienna. The young man was convinced that he was a genius, and he believed that getting into the Academy of Fine Arts would be child's play. However, his work had to be judged by the great professors of the school. To be judged means to have your work looked at by an expert who gives a formal opinion on its quality. In October 1907, his drawings were judged for the first time. There were 112 people trying to enter the school, and the competition was very high. He passed the first part of the test, but then he had to do a drawing composition test. When his final drawings were judged, the professors were not impressed with his talent. They gave him a very specific and painful critique. The professors judged that his drawings had too few heads. This means that he was good at drawing buildings and stones, but he was very bad at drawing people and faces. Because of this too few heads problem, he was rejected by the academy. To be rejected means to be dismissed or not accepted into a group or a school. This first rejection felt like a bolt from the blue, which is a giant and painful shock. He could not believe that the professors had judged him so poorly. He went to see the rector of the school to ask why he was rejected. The rector told him that his drawings showed a talent for architecture, not for painting. He was rejected as an artist, but he was told he could be an architect. However, he did not have the right school papers to study architecture, so he was trapped in his failure. He stayed in Vienna and tried to practice his drawing for another year. He was rejected again in September 1908, and this time it was even worse. He failed in the very first round of the test, and his drawings were not even judged for the second part. He was rejected for the second time, and his dreams of becoming a famous painter were dead. He felt a deep sense of shame and anger toward the professors. He called them stupid and old-fashioned. He began to hate the successful artists of the city and called them degenerates. He believed that the world of art was being poisoned by a Semitic spirit. Soon, his money from his mother's estate and his orphan's pension started to run out. He could no longer pay for the room on Stumpergasse, and he vanished into the dark world of the homeless. He moved to a homeless shelter in the district of Meidling. This was a terrible place where hundreds of men slept in one giant room. When he arrived at the Meidling shelter, he had to go through a process called burning out. This was a disinfection process where his clothes were heated to kill bugs and lice. Can you imagine the smell and the fear of a place where your clothes must be burned out to keep you clean? He slept on a small cot with brownish-colored sheets that were dirty and old. He ate thin soup and dry bread while he waited in long lines. He looked frail and helpless, and his hair was long and tangled. He wore a long, greasy coat that had been given to him by a Jewish man named Joseph Neumann. Despite his poverty, he spent his time in the hostel leading political debates. He was the ringleader of the arguments, and he shouted about the notorious press and the Jewish-controlled government. He met a man named Reinhold Hanisch, and they started a small business together. The young man would paint small postcards of the parliament and the opera, and Hanisch would sell them to tourists. But the young man was not happy being a postcard painter. He was angry that he had been rejected by the high world of art. He began to follow the ideas of two political leaders, Georg Ritter von Schonerer and Karl Lueger. Schonerer told him to hate people who were not German, and Lueger showed him how to use that hate to win the support of the masses. He watched as people on the streets shouted "Down with the Jews" and "Eastern Jews out." He decided that the otherness of the immigrants was the reason for his own failure. He believed that the Semitic spirit was a poison in the press and in the art world. What would you do if you felt the world was against you? Would you look for the truth, or would you believe the lies of the notorious pamphlets? The young man chose to believe the lies, and he built his granite foundation of hate in the homeless shelters of Vienna. In May 1913, he finally left the city to avoid joining the army. He fled to Munich, but he took the lessons of the School of Vienna with him. He was no longer an aspiring artist. He was a failed man with a heart full of dangerous ideas. Now, let's review the key words from this chapter. Listen carefully. These words will come back in the quiz. Judged. To have an opinion or conclusion formed about the quality of something, especially after a formal examination. For example, the singers were judged by their ability to hit the highest notes and their stage presence. Rejected. Refused to accept, consider, or use someone or something for a specific purpose. For example, he was very disappointed when the company rejected his job application because he did not have enough experience. Time to test your listening skills. Try to answer each question out loud before the answer is revealed. Drop your Chapter 4 score in the comments so we can cheer you on. How many times was Hitler rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts? The text and source context 67-75 describe his failures in 1907 and 1908. What was the specific critique given by the professors who judged his work? The source context explicitly mentions the too few heads critique 293. What was the burning out process at the Meidling homeless shelter? The narrative and source context 152 describe this as the sanitary burning out process for residents' clothing. Who helped Hitler sell his watercolor postcards while he lived in the men's hostel? Reinhold Hanisch was his business partner who peddled the paintings to dealers. Where did Hitler flee in May 1913 to avoid the Austrian army? The source context 30 and narrative confirm he fled to Munich. That's a wrap on episode 1, Failed Artist. If this helped your English, hit like and subscribe to help us make more videos like this. See you in the next one.